Hey everyone, I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader. This is the second part of my May reading wrap. I am very excited for this coming week because for those of you who've been following my channel, you'll know that I recently moved into this new flat and all of my books have been staying in boxes, but this week I have a great carpenter in who is going to be building me a library, so I'll finally be able to get them out and put them on the shelves. This is just a temporary arrangement up here. I'm going to be so happy to have my own library and reading room, and when it's all set up and ready, I'll do a bookshelf tour and show all of you it. I did a bookshelf tour before in my old flat, which I'll link up there if you want to watch that, so you can see sort of the before and after. I've also discovered in my new flat that there's a little guy who keeps trying to bury nuts in my back garden. That sounds a bit funny, doesn't it? I'll just leave that thought with you. So I've had a very busy couple weeks in the last 2 weeks of May. I read this amazing book, Anything is Possible by Elizabeth Strout. I think Elizabeth Strout is one of my favorite writers, and this new book is very much a follow-up from her last book, My Name is Lucy Barton. They're very connected, where she goes back to Lucy Barton's hometown in this rural town in Illinois, a farming town, and explores the lives of different people in that town, many of whom were connected to Lucy Barton in her childhood in some way, and shows how they've grown up and progressed. It's basically like a book of short stories that are sort of interlinked. And I had the amazing privilege to go see Elizabeth Strout read. She read at Waterstone's Gower Street, and she talked about this book and how while she was writing My Name is Lucy Barton, she kept having these peripheral characters come up who she thought were really interesting. She wanted to write about them more, but couldn't think of a way to fold them into the narrative of My Name is Lucy Barton without disrupting that first-person narrative. And so this is the result. And that sounds very gimmicky, but it works so beautifully. And you could read a lot in how these books speak to each other. It's made me really want to go back and read My Name is Lucy Barton. And after that reading, I went up and said hello to Elizabeth Strout and had her sign a couple of books. And I was really nervous about meeting her because if you've read any of her writing, you know she can write some very prickly characters. So I had this slight fear that she might be a very difficult person herself. But she was so lovely. I grew up in the state of Maine, and she writes often about characters in the state of Maine. This isn't set in Maine, but a lot of her novels are set in Maine. So I've always felt this special connection to her books because I really understand a lot of those characters and the landscape that she's writing about. And so for meeting her, I wore my special lobster t-shirt, which she really appreciated and thought was funny. So this is a really fantastic book that I'd highly recommend. I finished reading it while I went on a trip to the Gladstone's libraries in North Wales, and I made a whole vlog about that trip. It was a beautiful weekend, really like idyllic, out in the country, staying in a grand old library and just reading the whole weekend. I'll put a link up in the corner so you can watch that journey if you haven't already. Honestly, it's such a good thing to do for yourself. I'd really recommend just going away and having a reading weekend if you feel like you need to get some headspace. And while I was there, I read the novel Tin Man by Sarah Winman, which hasn't been published yet. It's going to be published in July. But this is such a powerful and beautiful book. It's basically about a love triangle and also the process of grief of a man who has lost the people who are closest to him in his life. And it tunnels back through his life, so you see the development of his relationship. And something I appreciate about it so much is how it shows like the real organic growth of this relationship between these two men and a woman. These two men grow up together, they're very close, it develops into a sexual and romantic relationship. But the central character can't commit to a gay lifestyle. He meets a woman and marries her, but the three of them remain very close as a unit. And she just shows this relationship so beautifully, while also talking about painting and color in a way that really strongly conveys emotion. And I really connected to it because here's a bit of personal information. When I was a teenager, I had a relationship with a married couple, a man and a woman, and I fell in love with them both. And it was a really complicated emotional situation. And I think Sarah Winman captures that feeling so beautifully in this book. It's honestly, I think, going to be one of my top books of the year, so watch out for it, Tin Man by Sarah Winman. So on the evening I got back from the Gladstone's library, when I got back to London, I went to the Green Carnation Prize, which is a fabulous award that honors LGBT LGBT authors and the books that they've published in the past year. And as probably many of you know, it was co-founded by Simon Savage, who's my bearded book buddy and a prolific booktuber himself. So I'll show you here his introduction and why he thinks the prize is still relevant. So watch this.
Why do we still need this prize? And I think Simon put it really, really well in the fact that the way the world is at the moment, things are better in the UK and we have made steps forward and that's fantastic, but what about the rest of the world? And what about over just a simple election change, or unfortunately possibly not? Things can get dark and we need books to escape, but we also need to study LGBT history to see what's happened before and make sure it doesn't happen again. If you look at the list of books, they all deal with people on the outside, and I think that's something that we feel proud that the LGBT community is becoming more and more on the inside, but is it really? And that's why I think the prize is so important, and also because it gets corking books into people's hands.
And after Simon gave his introduction, the author John Boyne came on the stage because he was the chair of judges. John Boyne is most famously the author of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, but he also this year published a novel called The Heart's Invisible Furies, which is a big, epic, beautiful book that I'd really encourage you all to read. And he gave quite a funny introduction where he also made a ploy because he's looking for a boyfriend. So you can watch his introduction and announcement of the winner here.
So we've got 5 books here tonight, and they all have some really terrific and important messages in them. But if you go away from this evening with one message that you remember, let me just point out it's this: I'm recently single. If you're interested, or if you know someone who might be interested, I have a very nice house in Dublin. And those boys like pajamas roses, they just keep growing in. It's on the syllabus. So we had to choose one in the end, and the process this morning was very hard, but the discussion that went along with it was just as interesting. And for book lovers, like all of us here tonight, it was a great joy. And in our final vote, we were actually unanimous in choosing a book that we feel is of real importance. A book that reaches out beyond the LGBTQ community into the world beyond, that looks at history, tragedy, and optimism in equal parts. It's a book that belongs alongside the most important works of 20th century history. It is definitive, it is passionate, and it is enlightening. The winner of the 2016 Green Carnation Prize is David France.
So the Green Carnation Prize Party was really fun, and it was great to see that How to Survive a Plague won this award. It's a really amazing non-fiction book that recounts key figures in the fight against AIDS during the 80s and 90s. I read it at the end of last year, and I talked about it in the second part of my November reading wrap-up, so I'll put a link for that up there. Next, I read a classic novel, and I don't read all that much older fiction. Usually I just read new current fiction. But I was inspired to read this because at Waterstone's Gower Street, they're doing a fantastic range of book events. And one new regular event they're doing is the Forgotten Book Club, where they look at classics from yesteryear which have been slightly forgotten. And so at this meeting they were talking about The Lshaped Room by Lynne Reid Banks, as well as a novel by Jean Rhys. And I sort of shamefully had never heard of this book, even though it's a classic, a really seminal feminist text about a woman who's pregnant and unmarried in 1960, and how her father throws her out of her house and she has to try to make an independent life for herself in a dingy flat in London. And before I'd even read it, I felt this weird connection with it because the author, Lynne Reid Banks, also wrote the children's book, The Indian in the Cupboard, which was one of my favorite books as a child. However, this novel couldn't be more different. It's written in a really strong realist mode, talking about big social issues. And I felt really conflicted reading about it too, because although it was obviously quite progressive for the time, talking quite openly about this unmarried pregnant woman and all the social stigmas which were still attached to that condition. But then she's someone who has a lot of her own prejudices as well, and you see her interacting and talking with gay people and people of color, and she has a very dodgy way of talking about them and has opinions about them that really make you cringe. And it was interesting in the group meeting at Waterstones, we talked about how how that was just sort of the lingo of the time. That's how people talked about black people and gay people, and how that was just sort of unconscious because that was the culture. So it's an interesting sort of time capsule in that way, but I found it a really powerful novel. I got sucked into her story, and I really got involved reading about her struggle for independence and all of the challenges she faced of the time. And I hope the Forgotten Book group keeps meeting and they keep having different events, because it's a fantastic idea, and I had a lot of fun talking with all the people there and having gin cocktails. Also, before the end of May, I went to a book launch of Juno Dawson, who's an author of young adult books but has a new non-fiction memoir out called The Gender Games, because a few years ago Juno Dawson was James Dawson, and she's since gone through the transition of becoming a woman. And there's a funny personal connection between me, Juno Dawson, and Simon Savage, where I think around like 3 or 4 years ago, Simon Savage and I got the idea to start a bearded book club, because we both have beards and we're big readers, and we thought it would be great to get a group of bearded men together to talk about books. So we made this like big plan to start this book club and sent an open invite out, and made plans for our first meeting. And of course we didn't want to just limit it to bearded men. We wanted to have pagonophiles too, who are people who appreciate beards. So we had men and women who were all enthusiastic and said they wanted to come to this club. We set a first meeting date at a pub, and we showed up, and nobody came except for James Dawson. So the book club was a bit of a failure, but we had fun. The three of us just had drinks and chatted, and we didn't really pick up on the idea of that book club again. So there you go. But it was fun to go to Juno Dawson's launch, and you can hear her talking about the book a bit here.
And then onto the book. So yeah, it's a weird one. This is my 10th book, which is crazy, but it's my first one for grown-ups, and it's certainly my first memoir, which is ridiculous because I'm only 19. So it's like I haven't really had time to deal with kind of how vulnerable and weird it feels to publish a memoir, and that you are kind of letting people in. I had a really simple choice 3 years ago when I knew that I was going to go ahead with the transition. I could have either done a Greta Garbo and hidden away and done a big sort of Caitlyn Jenner before and after, or I could take you all with me. And I felt, given that a lot of my readers are young adults, it would be doing them a huge disservice to kind of turn transitioning into some sort of America's Next Top Model makeover. And so the last 3 years I've changed outwardly a lot, but inwardly not at all. But what's so wonderful is that I have a room full of people who have never questioned me, who have accepted me, who have never told me about some of those things I chose to wear. That wasn't helpful on reflection, was it? Transitioning in the public eye can be quite difficult. It is not without its problems. I've said stupid things, I've made mistakes, I will say more stupid things, and I will make more mistakes. But it's really reassuring to know that I've got such wonderful publishers and such wonderful friends and family backing me up every step. So please do enjoy, get really drunk, and thank you so much for coming.
I think this book launch night became one of like my gayest nights ever. So I was at Juno's book launch with my wonderful friend Uli, who's co-manager of Gaze the Word Bookshop. He was selling copies of Juno's book there. He's one of my very closest friends. He's an amazing person, an insightful reader, and he enjoys a few good drinks. So we have a lot of fun when we get together. And at that book launch night, they had special cocktails by Absolute Vodka. It really felt like I was in RuPaul's Drag Race or something, because yes, there were cocktails by Absolute, and they were so easy to drink. So I ended up having about 8 or 9 of these cocktails. And then Uli and I went on to a gay pub where there was a quiz night hosted by this drag queen, and there was only about 7 or 8 other people in the pub. So we were very conspicuous and sat at the front and were interacting with the queen a lot. So yeah, all those things make it just about like the gayest night ever, don't they? So moving on, finally, the last book I read in May was Gwendoline Riley's novel First Love, this is shortlisted for the Bailey's Fiction Prize. And I've been sort of saving it up because it's quite a short novel. I went into reading it with a clear, open mind, and I despised it. I think it's a mean, cold little novel. It's about a writer named Nev and her complicated marriage with an older man, but it's not even really that complicated. He's just really awful and horrible to her, and she sort of passively takes it. And this novel made me really angry because I think that's a really difficult and compelling subject. She's writing basically about the people that we love most in our lives can sometimes be really horrible to us, and that's a really difficult dilemma, and we question why that happens. I think she had the opportunity to talk about this in a really complicated way, but I felt like she was being completely withholding and didn't let us get to know the characters at all. So I got really upset reading this book, and I think it doesn't have anything interesting to say. You can hear me talking more about this book with Anna James, and she has some very strong opinions about it too. So I'll put a link up to her video if you want to see us discussing the entire Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction shortlist. So yes, the winner for this prize will be announced very soon on June 7th, and I'll be going to that prize ceremony with Anna James. So it'll be really exciting to see the results of that award. If this book wins, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I might just explode on camera for you. So that's what I've been reading and doing for the past couple of weeks. I'll put links below. If you click show more, you can read my full reviews of these books that I talked about and to the videos I discussed. So if you've read any of the books that I've talked about, or you're interested in reading any of the books I talked about, let me know in the comments below and we can have a chat about them. But hope you're all doing well, and happy reading, everyone.